Generation rules the nation.
You are listening to Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we discuss everything but politics. We're here with two good friends of the show, Mahi.
Hello, you guys. How are you?
Returning after a long absence.
Yes.
Several of our early episodes.
Sure.
As well as Yani. Hi, Yani.
Hi, nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you for the very first time. So both of you are medical doctors. Yani from Germany. Just came back recently, been kind of going back and forth. And I wanted to start off with talking about, since everybody else has been addressing it on like every other platform, and we mostly stray away from politics on this channel, but that's mostly Ethiopian politics is what we try to avoid. So there's obviously the issue of Ukraine, what's going on there, that's sort of taken over everybody's attention. So you were just in Germany, which is kind of caught between what's going on between the United States and the former Soviet Union, Russia. So if you could tell us what you've taught yourself recently, or what you've learned about the ongoing crisis in Ukraine.
All right. So first of all, I'm happy that I don't have to talk about Ethiopian politics, as my knowledge about that is very, very limited. Although I was following on that, especially since I spent like almost 2 years in Ethiopia, working in Asella as a medical doctor. And now as the Ukraine conflict caught Europe, life seems a little bit different than previously. So in the very beginning of this conflict, it's hard to define where this conflict starts. So does it start in 1990? Does it start in 2004 or 5? Does it start in 2014, or does it start now in 2022? So it's a long story. It has a long background. But if I want to start with one thing, it's the big game changer in Europe. So it's that event which is the game changer since 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Mm-hmm. So when you say, because one of the arguments that people have made, not so much to justify or vindicate Putin specifically, but to sort of be like, hey, putting NATO, what really started this was NATO going into Ukraine, is that originally NATO, according to the agreement right around that period that you just mentioned, NATO was not supposed to expand, in the language of the document, I believe they said, an inch to the east of Germany, right? And then there are a number of things happened in the 90s that kind of put Russia on its heels as far as the power policies. I mean, Russia, when I was a kid, when we were kids, was a society in complete freefall after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Economically, the shock therapy with Jeffrey Sachs hadn't worked, and
Definitely.
so on. And so it was really Clinton in that era that kept expanding. But the thought of it really expanding all the way to Ukraine was sort of beyond the pale for anybody in the 90s, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the 1990s we came there, so there was Gorbachev, there was Bush, there was Kohl, and they were all working it out together. So they seem to have a very good personal connection on a personal level. So
this is Helmut Kohl, the
yes.
Chancellor of Germany.
The big guy.
Right, the big guy.
Yes. So, and he did a lot of nice things. So he was always approaching people on a personal level. So he was like doing private things like hiking or going to sauna or something like this. So he always, with the political leaders of the Soviet Union, right? Mm. So he was trying to get a good personal connection to those people. And after that, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, Germany was in this incredibly interesting role that it has been part of the two blocs. It has been part of the NATO with Western Germany, and it has been part of the Warsaw Pact with the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, as the communist state of Germany was called. And it was, you can say, it was somehow best from two worlds. So we had the good connection to Russia as well. And this was helping us economically. We could expand to Russia. German companies had quite an easy access to Russia and could do trade. and this was also following the political linkage. So when we started to do trade with Russia in the 1970s, there was a program which was called Change by Rapprochement, which means this authoritarian state, as we consider the Soviet Union, we cannot change it. We cannot not say, oh, please be democratic right now, or please abolish communism right now. But we could say, okay, we do trade, we do meetings, and we try to change this by approaching each other. So this was the core concept of German politics since the 60s, 70s.
And now this has kind of been jeopardized, or it's been compromised.
Now now we have to deal with our history. So now we see Russia is acting different than before. So Russia is starting an aggression in the Ukraine, and Germany is somehow trapped in this still. So we still want to be somehow buddies of Russia.
Right.
So because we have a lot of friends coming from the Soviet Union or from Russia in the 1990s, growing up in Germany. There's so many people coming from there, and they have very good connections on a personal level. There's nearly nothing such as racism or something like this. They come to Germany, they do very good work.
Not to mention the extensive resources, right?
Of course.
I don't think people really we can't wrap our minds around how much oil, how much forestry, how much they have in their backyard in the Soviet Union.
But also the exchange. In Germany, a lot of children learn Russian in school. So especially in the eastern parts of Germany, but also in western parts of Germany. So in my school, I could learn Russian too. So I don't speak a lot because I failed, but it's another story.
But so it's interesting you touch on that. You mentioned East and West, because that was the first thing I thought. Is that my understanding is that one of the principal divisions within German society now is still the questions of how does the West absorb the East, the former communist East that is still socioeconomically and in other ways is sort of in a subjugated position, and there is there's still that continuing sense of conflict. So I would think that is also mirrored in this in the geopolitics.
It is, and this may also make us do understanding better, because in Eastern Germany we saw, okay, well, the state you've been living for so long has just collapsed. The money you've been paid in is nothing worth anymore. All the structures and ideology you believed in has simply vanished from one day to another. So Russia experienced the same. So this is why a lot of people in Germany can understand the Russians in the 1990s when this great empire, the state they believed in, was crushing.
Because of the World War II experience, or
because they shared the same experience at the same time. So their biographies.
Oh, with East Germany, okay.
East Germany, yes. And okay, from Western Germany, we still. Of course, the people were somehow working on their history and realizing what they did in Eastern Europe, and especially to the Soviet Union, like killing so many millions of people there.
Right. I think the figures are, 20-30 million Russians were killed in that war. So it is an interesting place to be, right? Germany in the midst of sort of at the center of this conflict, but. It's interesting from my perspective, having been born and mostly raised in the United States, that for me, fundamentally, the 90s are the good period. I still yearn for the 90s culturally and so on.
The end of history, right?
The end of history, right? Francis Fukuyama, right? But which was ridiculous, right? It was like 10 years of the United States not being in conflict with anyone majorly. However, and you had the neoliberal consensus and all that. But, however, for me, being a kid, I remember when the towers went down. I was 20 miles away, and I could see it from my school window. And so it had my whole adult life going back to high school, Islamic radicalism, right? Whether it's Al Qaeda, whether it's ISIS, that was always the major conflict that the United States were into. In recent years, I remember people laughed at Mitt Romney for saying that Vladimir Putin was America's principal, antagonist in the world. That's the major enemy when there's still, ISIS and all that. People laughed at him. Now suddenly, and nobody talks about this because I guess the only thing we're talking about is bad news. Yeah. But I don't remember, knock on wood, a major Islamic radical attack in the West in quite some time. It seems like ISIS has kind of slowed down. So now it seems like the old civilizational conflict between East and West, between Catholic/Protestant West and the Orthodox East, and a kind of a reemergence of the old Cold War conflicts, that's now replaced the old clash of civilizations that I grew up with.
Yeah, I like that you're linking it to civilizations and not only to the ideology of capitalism and communism, so that old duality, because I think the roots are also in Russia before that. I mean, Russia has been part of Europe and outside of Europe for the same time for centuries. They always wanted to be somehow part and have some influence, and they also wanted to be respected in Europe for centuries, but always they have been kept a little bit outside. And they have been always feared in the history. You can study this in a lot of conflicts. So Napoleon attacking the Russians, and like this. So there was
Russophobia, always, they call it.
Yes,
right?
always this fear from this empire in the east, which we do not really understand.
Right.
Understand, yeah. And the Americans, I guess, yes, of course, they had different perspectives. They were so busy with their war on terrorism, and then when they noticed their failures in Iraq and Afghanistan to somehow get out of that, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they were approaching China as their new main threat. So Russia somehow, they somehow also lost the track on Russia. So nobody had Russia in this period from, let's say, 2008-9 until 2014. Nobody had Russia on their screens.
Yeah, except Mitt Romney, apparently.
Maybe Mitt Romney.
Apparently, randomly Mitt Romney. No, but it was strange when he said that. Like, we're like, oh yeah, Russia. But it goes back to, I mean, so we agree, it's not purely ideological, because the whole debate, the whole perception of the Cold War was the sphere of influence of one empire versus another, or the capitalist free world versus the communist system. Whatever. I mean, in the end, Putin. What does Putin believe in? What is the ideological conflict with the United States? Right. It's not. I wouldn't call him a nationalist. Not really. Not in any meaningful sense of the term. I don't think he has any economic or ideology. He's just. I can understand that Russians love him because, again, going back to the 90s, that the kind of humiliation that they went through. People forget the guy who was there before Putin was Yeltsin.
Yeah,
even worse than Gorbachev as far as like national embarrassment, right? Yeah. Yeltsin, who was falling asleep drunk on airplanes during state visits,
and being searched by the Secret Service in the White House for
exactly
running out drunk.
Right, and doing his ridiculous dance with that frown on his. I mean. After that, I understand how the Russian people feel about, hey, we don't care as long as this guy is someone we can be proud of and who's going to defend the interests of Mother Russia. But so it's no longer an ideological conflict. No, it's not really an economic one. You can't really call it imperialism, not in the Cold War sense, not in the expansive sense. I mean, is it just a civilizational thing in the end? Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think, sorry, I guess it's really an imperialistic thing, because I don't think Putin, although he came from the KGB, he's not someone attached to that ideology. So he's not a communist for sure, at least not anymore. So I guess he's someone who also believed in the Russian Empire, and was somehow. Dealing with Russian history a lot, right. So which is surprising, was one element that he is searching for close connection to the Orthodox Church in Russia. Right. So this was abandoned also for 100 years with the communists. So this is one element putting him back in the pre-communist era. And but it doesn't matter. So
right, it doesn't matter. Yeah,
if it's communist imperialism
right.
or if it's imperialism. So I think he's just someone who, when he sees an opportunity, is also choosing decisive actions to do that. So when in the Ukraine, the protests on the Maidan were occurring, and there seemed to be the possibility to get the Crimea back. I mean, he was just taking decisive actions. And he did it. And in the West, we said, well, okay, the Crimea has been long part of Russia. Stalin was given it as a present to Ukraine.
You can kind of make the same argument about Ukraine, right? There's large numbers of Russia. And you could also make the argument, I mean, the United States, at its foundation, had the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically like all of the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence. The Chinese, make aggressive actions.
Yeah, that's what the Russians did.
Right. So the Russians are like, we're no different. Why is? I also find it strange that they always insult Putin. Like, I've never heard a leader being, like, randomly insulted by the Americans. He's a thug. He's a killer. These things might be true, but it's a little strange how persistently he alone is insulted in this way. And I also think the last thing I notice about Putin is...
That's economy of media, just creating attention to something.
Right. But I don't see them doing this. I mean, I don't even remember people sitting there and like, literally calling Bin Laden names. And, of course, they could have, and they would have been okay. But I don't remember them choosing to do it, right? But the other thing is, like, Vladimir Putin is getting older. Like you said it yourself, he's been around since the days of, the fall of, he wants to make his mark on history, right?
Yeah,
and
definitely.
now the opportunity was presented to him,
Definitely. I mean, it was always, from the Western perspective, difficult to understand. In the Ukraine, so many Russians were living, they all shared the same country they were originating from, like the Soviet Union. So they were all born there, had the same history, they speak the same language. So it's hard to understand who wants to live in which nation, at least from Western perspective.
Yeah.
So we had a big big problems of understanding these actions in the 2014-15 emerging conflict there, that we could not clearly distinguish. Are this really some Russians who want to who get shelter from Russia, Mother Russia protecting them, or are those nationalists fed by Putin to start a conflict there? So we thought it could be maybe both, and this is maybe why the West did not take decisive actions at the very beginning.
Right.
So,
Right.
and the big difference now is we've observed over the last years that Russia is not sticking to the agreements made, as well as the Ukraine, but that's another story.
Yeah.
So and that Russia is being like more dominant and also testing the West. I mean, in 2021, Russia started deploying troops and building it up, and somehow they did it like a pilot balloon to test how we would react and how West would react. And then he said, as there was no big reaction. Okay,
Right.
well, maybe let's do it and let's build this all up. And I've never seen it in such a long time, like carefully positioning troops here, troops there, preparing to invade from Belarus, from Crimea, from Russia. So I think he calculated that Western countries would react in the same way as they did before.
Yeah.
And maybe
Which is to say, not react to the same extent. No, it's just interesting again as a people say this about Black Americans, that we are the most critical of America. We make America seem, but like as far as countries not following their what you just mentioned about Putin, like refusing to follow the accords or the agreements that he himself made. I mean, that's how the American started the Vietnam War, was rejecting a treaty. And ask them, the American Indians, right? I mean, there's so many, I think hundreds of treaties that were signed with the American government, not one of which the American government ever upheld. So even that, treaties, agreements, famously Stalin came to a sort of non-aggression treaty with Hitler, which... in retrospect, was probably a bit disingenuous on his part. Like he knew that this was so. But anyway, we've.
I mean, also the U.S. quit a lot of those treaties, right? Like in the Trump era and even before, they could not agree on continuing, like the Open Skies Agreement, like the INF Treaty, or some SALT treaties. So they were not. So a lot of very important treaties have been abandoned in the time before the war. So it seemed like that international policy based on contracts has somehow lost value. Also in the Trump era. Right. So that's also something to
because the contract is only meaningful within the context of power relations, whereby people are going to be forced to maintain. This is the criticism of the United Nations Security Council.
Yes, sure.
I mean, they're constantly saying you have to follow this rules, you have to follow that rules. But what are you going to do about it?
That's criticism of international law. And this is also linking closely back again to Germany. I mean, if we're in terms of international law, someone has to enforce it. Right. And if Germany wants, for example, to find a solution by negotiation, as they always claim in international conflicts, they would also have some ways to find a mechanism which can be enforced. Right,
because international law is. We had somebody on here. I forget his name. What was it? Somebody, we were talking about history. We were talking about constitutions and constitutional development in Ethiopia, and he was making the point like the difference between international law and any other kind of law is that it is supposed to be codified, like absolute codification. If it's not codified, international law is the one kind of law that it's not codified. It's completely meaningless, right? It's So I don't know how you codify anything that the UN does, or really that the EU or any of these.
I mean, the UN is useless because Russia has a veto and the US have a veto, and China has a veto. Right. So and some other states have also veto rights.
England and France of all the countries, which is bizarre. That France has a veto.
I mean, it's the post Second World War.
Right, which is no longer.
Yes, it does not reflect the actual situation. I mean, we can also talk about nations like India or Brazil or whoever. We could have such a position like that.
Sure. And whether or not anybody should have a veto power. Like, is it meaningful to say we have a community of nations, we have an organization, when any one of 5 countries can hold up the will of 100 or 200 other countries, right?
Yeah.
So we just went through the span of the whole geopolitical context, but we should bring Mahi back into this discussion
yes.
if she's. Do you
As
want to
you guys-
get close to the mic? Yeah.
Yeah, as you guys know, I don't really follow politics because I don't really think it's it's very interesting for me.
Right, you've spared yourself a lot of
yes,
of headaches,
misery,
obviously, as you can tell.
discomfort.
But I wanted to transition to the second subject matter, which is both of you are medical doctors. Obviously, Marit, you're Ethiopian and a woman. Yani, you came from Germany, and in the context of, obviously, you came here during the height of the pandemic, and we were talking beforehand about some of your thoughts about medical migration and these sort of north-south coalitions. So could you tell us what you guys have learned or what you've taught yourselves when it comes to that kind of thing? You want to start off, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to just like international medicine, especially the last 3 years where COVID has started, I have seen a lot of foreign aid and foreign NGOs try to make roots here, especially after the production of the vaccinations, and by volunteering to do a lot of the work where they have to treat patients and give educational like feedback. And in a way, I have seen, I mean, this has been going on for almost a lot more before that, but the major shift that I have seen is I have definitely seen research methodologies or like research fields become more prominent, especially in the migration from the northern part of the European countries, like the medical personnel kind of transitioning into research, research-based studies to come to the African countries and other parts of Asia and Arabic Peninsula to study more, especially where Yani is concerned about most of the infectious diseases, as you know, is they're still more rampant in third world countries like Africa and Far East Asia and Arabic Peninsulas, and those studies would not usually be something that are prominent in European, in the US and in Canada and other parts of the most Western world. So I've seen a lot more of the NGOs become more prominent, especially after vaccination issues or vaccination teachings. And I have seen a lot more of those physicians and researchers and anybody that's mostly related to the research part of medicine to be more interested in coming to the central parts of Africa and the more south parts of the world to study more of that. And I mean, in one way that's a good thing. I would say it really helps, but in other ways there are, I think, disadvantages, especially when it comes to the COVID situation, where I really don't think they did as much of an equally prospective research to know what the vaccination would do in the long run to the other parts of the nation. But that's what I've seen and read. But I don't know what Yani thinks, but yeah.
Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, well, that's a very long run you've been through, Mahi. So, I mean, starting first, it's when it comes to medical partnerships from the north and from the global north and the global south, it's been a long history. So it started, and we can be very clear on this, it started with colonialism. So people coming here, and they had two main goals. Why are the white people coming to Africa dying? And how could we save the labor forces of those being here? So this was the start of, if you would call it in an ironic way, cooperation or medical medical treatments or medical or dealing with medical issues in the south regarding to Africa.
Can I just ask to clarify? The question is that they were asking is why are like settlers, like Europeans who go down to Africa, why are they dying? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So not why are Africans dying of these?
Both questions. Both questions. So I mean, when they were coming to the coasts, and they're bringing like 100 men, and they're checking a year after, and then maybe 80% of them have died. So then the question is why? How could we ensure that those people live here and can do trade or imperialism or whatever? That's the one thing. And the other thing, if you think of construction projects like railway lines or anything like this, so you're building huge streets or railway lines through the rainforest, and then the workers you need, you could never bring so many workers from Europe to Africa. So the idea was always to exploit those Africans working there. But of course you could not exploit them in such a way that they would not be able to work. And from this ideology, the field which we would now call tropical medicine in Europe and in the US later on also developed from. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's also, you know, when people talk about, for instance, why do sort of the classic left-wing or Marxian take on like the Civil War, you know, why the abandonment of slavery, why this gradual is that, you know, as long as you really just want to own the labor, it's really about owning the labor and putting as little cost and as little risk. Right, so if you own the person, there's much more risk involved if something were to happen to that person. But you basically just want enough of an investment to make sure that you can get that person to work in order to exploit them, right? So
that was the very beginning. That was the very beginnings. But now let's skip maybe 100 years or even more, and come back to the times now. So nowadays, at least from the perspective. In the institutions where I worked in was always we want to do sustainable projects. We want to be on the same level partners. And Mahi and University, I'm working at the Düsseldorf University in Germany. They had the chance in 2013 to start a cooperation with the Adama Science and Technology University, which somehow had a German president at that time, as Ethiopia was trying to build up universities after some patterns, and also took this German experience into account. And then my boss somehow knew someone working in Adama, and then somehow they got into touch, and then developed this idea of using the medical faculty in Asella to establish a long-term collaboration project. And so this is where I came in. So I came like almost 10 years later, or 7 years later in 2020. This was a running cooperation. We have enrolled a few Ethiopian microbiologists in PhD programs in Ethiopia. We send like every year almost like 1 or 2 German doctors coming to Ethiopia. And we tried to impose a collaboration on the same level. And from the research part, I think we succeeded very, very nicely. And then I came shortly before the COVID pandemic started. So when I came, the idea was, well, let's establish some digital health projects, think about sepsis in Africa and antimicrobial resistance. But then out of nowhere, COVID appeared. Right. And I found myself not being surrounded by so many white guys and others, and people from NGO, but when I was here in, let's say, February or March 2020, I felt like, oh, where have all those people gone to? I didn't see any of those NGO guys or even diplomats were retreating to the country. And my colleague Marlene and me, we were at that time also about to make a decision. Should we stay in Ethiopia? We have a disease which is not known. We have no treatment options. We would be very likely highly exposed. Or should we go back to Germany? And we thought, well, okay, good. I mean, also in Germany, we are likely to be highly exposed. And as we have this chance, this great collaboration project, we can also use our presence here to get funds, to start projects, for example, with the GIZ company, to find out more about COVID and to fight COVID as well. So-
And this is how you end up in Asila?
Yeah, I mean, this was then becoming somehow my main part in Nacella, and we can see it from many different perspectives. I mean, we've been able to get protective equipment. We've been set up one of the first COVID testing labs in Ethiopia. So I think we were second or third after EPHI testing, and at the beginning we had like a zone of like 10 million people. So they were driving like 8 hours or 12 hours to bring samples to our lab to be tested. And I'm not coming from laboratory department or from microbiology, so I'm infectious disease guy. So it was quite a challenge for us to put this up on a level. But on the other hand, this is what I would call pandemic preparedness now. At the moment, COVID was a big challenge for everyone, and was putting a lot of stress on the projects which were started before. But now, also cities like Asella or other district cities in Ethiopia now have also got a big capacity upgrade. So they are now able to run molecular biology technology in a much broader scale than previously. So maybe if there's one thing positive about COVID in Africa, that it's a push into new technologies which can be used for other diseases later as well. So
Yeah, it's a little bit analogous to the possible silver lining in the U.S., which is this has exposed the absurdity of a country as wealthy as U.S. not having a public health system, and how destructive that could be when something like this happens. Of course, it's not like they've set one up in the last 2 years, but still, I think that might create more of a push, more of a reason for doing that. But we had talked about this, I think, the first time that you and I met. So first of all, tell us a little bit about Asila for people who don't know what that community is like and what it was like being there for you as a doctor from Europe.
Well, it depends if you're an Ethiopian or an international auditory, but coming from Addis, which is for me quite a still international city, you go like 180 kilometers down south, you pass Adama, which is a very hot region, and then you go up into the hills or the mountains of Arsi, where the great Ethiopian runners came from, right?
Yeah.
And this is a very hilly region. It's cold weather, so you don't have, and it's very high, like 2,400 meters above sea level. So it's a mountain climate. It's not always hot, but also very rainy and also cold. So it's a city of, let's say, about I think 200,000 inhabitants, more or less, with the surroundings, and it's the capital of the Arsi zone, which has about like 4.5 million inhabitants. And in Asella, there's a hospital, the Asella Teaching and Referral Hospital, and there's the Arsi University, which is running the College of Health Sciences. And they're both located on a very nice compound there. And on this compound, we also have our institute, which is mainly focusing on research, capacity building, education, projects. And yeah, I mean, I was coming to Asella, and on my first day, we live a little bit outside the city, so there are 2 old Swedish missionary houses where the Germans are living in. I was invited by local people, and it was an Ethiopian Christmas, so I was eating dorowat with the local people on my very first day.
That's a nice way to welcome.
So it's a very welcoming.
Yeah.
So I felt like being welcomed very, very soon. And
do you notice as someone from foreign perspective, like I'm sure the answer is yes, but what kind of differences? I'm sure there are sharp differences between like people in the urban areas, especially Addis Ababa, and people in Asella. Like, is it when it comes to the welcoming thing you just mentioned, or anything else?
I think in general in Ethiopia I always felt very welcoming. So this is a general impression. So in other African countries I visited, it was different. For example, Zimbabwe, but in Ethiopia in general I found it like this. And getting back to the traces, I mean, it's of course it's not such an urban population as it is in Addis Ababa. They are not spoiled by the African Union or by the NGOs working here or by the international companies. So it's a rural area. The people there were farmers. They were doing also some trade. They're growing crops.
I think it was just mostly curiosity, because maybe they haven't seen foreigners and had personal interactions with them at the same time.
They couldn't tell if I'm coming from China or coming from Europe.
Yeah, just a white guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you get confused for the Chinese who come.
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
It's interesting from a Western perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe if I'm going way further, I mean, I've spent so much time in Africa now that for me, I'm trying to see a lot of difference of people coming from different regions, and that I claim to distingush.
Right. But besides the
from
welcoming
what?
factor,
But,
though, because
yeah.
people always say that Ethiopia is very different.
Yeah.
I hear other Africa, I hear people from Kenya, Uganda, not far away, say, "Oh, it's different here." Is there anything that you've noticed as far as, I guess, Ethiopia versus other places of Africa, besides people being more welcoming?
Well, they're self-confident.
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 Huh.
I mean, they don't have the history of being colonized, and they have been the history of being of fighting against the Italians.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is something which makes them proud. And also regarding to medicine, they have not experienced a lot of people coming in there, building up structures, taking over the control. So in Ethiopia, people had to do it by themselves or build up systems by themselves.
Right.
And this is a totally different approach. Also, they don't have this learned helplessness. They don't have this. They have
There's
a
more of
totally
a
different
culture of indigeneity, almost like
Yeah.
things
Yeah. They're
things
proud.
kind of growing up from.
Yeah, they're proud, and you also have to know this when you're doing a project. So, and of course, this applies for all projects, especially also in medicine. You have to do this on the same level, and you have to think about what's the perspective of your partner, what's important for him or for them to get.
Yeah.
And especially, I think in Ethiopia, this is even more considered than other countries.
And one of the things that I've seen in working with like the NGOs and like volunteering is, as he said, the approach when being helped, like especially in the rural areas, is most of it has to be like on a friendly sense and not like on the charity service, because as Ethiopians we're quite proud, very unapologetic, and have kind of that, this is our this is our country, this is our resource kind of mentality. So at the end of the day, if somebody from a foreign country would come and give their service, their approach has to be even more of a friendly, we work with you by your side kind of approach, especially with colleagues. What I've seen is, you can go to the community and give them some training and some of the informations that you have, but especially working with colleagues, if you are a foreigner especially, it has to be in a very respectful approach where you're not even telling them, even if you're the boss or the leader, it has to come from a very, poised and very friendly, as like part of a colleague basis, because that would be quite difficult. This is how the culture is going as well, especially in the healthcare service, as I've seen in many of the NGOs.
Mm-hmm.
It's a personal level, and on the institutional level, just to say, you don't have to overrate what you're doing there. I mean, of course, we are putting some projects on there, but I mean, there's so many people from Ethiopia providing healthcare in the hospital, and the people who are coming from abroad and putting on their projects. They may do an important part in research, but when it comes for the clinical daily work, the impact is maybe much less than it is expected or seen from a funder's perspective, maybe, if someone is trying to fund you from a grant. But nevertheless, I guess at least in COVID we did a good job, and we established a very nicely running cooperation.
Especially when it comes to COVID, yes, definitely. Ethiopia has seen the best fruits of foreign aid, definitely, because even the interaction has been quite healthier before the start of the pandemic. There were already a lot of Chinese, Japanese companies, a lot of European companies that were already interested in working in that healthcare field. So I have seen a lot of the positive advantages of having that kind of healthy interaction that produced a lot more medical aid and medical help in the form of NGOs, or in particularly in even private ways of helping, especially in East Africa and especially in Ethiopia as well. So
yeah, that leads us to, we're going to wrap up here pretty soon, but that's another area I wanted to get to, which is the first time you and I spoke, we had this conversation about why is it, besides the funding, the intervention, which I would agree was pretty successful. I really feel like we dodged a bullet. I remember the paranoia in this town 2 years ago. This time 2 years ago, around the spring. I mean,
they were gonna die.
Oh yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
This
It was
crazy. You could feel it everywhere.
Yeah, you were here already back then. Yeah, it was right when you got here. So
The mood changed simply on one day to another. When that's this first case on March 13th in Ethiopia,
Yeah.
people before that were saying, okay, well, I mean, we closed the borders.
No,
and God may
this is
protect
North
us,
Korea, yeah.
and all these things I heard.
Yeah.
And then there was the first case, this
From
Japanese
Japan,
guy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the mood changed, and also the small children were like, "Oh, there's someone coming from the west. Oh, let's keep
Yeah.
some distance."
Anybody
Yeah.
that was light skinned was
Yeah.
completely
So we were the
shunned
people
from the community.
bringing COVID.
right.
So
Yeah,
that was the
the
perception.
the anti-Asian discrimination that
Camaraderie
came
is
out of.
definitely
I
there.
mean, here people listen. People in Australia can't even tell the difference between a white person and Asian. Getting back to comparing things to the U.S.,
Yeah.
I think in the future people are going to look back at the way in which Asian Americans were treated, the hate crimes and so on, that went back and be like, this whole illness really exposed a lot of dark things about that society again. But so the question I had for you was, why do you think? What are the among all the different factors that might be laid out? People point to the Neanderthal gene. People point to the climate. People point to the fact that outside of some places like Addis Ababa, which are incredibly dense, not even though it's a very large population, it's not always the most dense in certain areas. People point to underreporting. People point to any number of factors. You think, what was it, that the youth of the population is the main one?
I think basically youth of the population is one of the most important factors. So at the beginning, as you said, we have to see there's a newly virus emerging, or a newly infection emerging in the population. So you would have to construct the infrastructure of detecting it. So in the first phase, you don't have the possibility to detect this on the one hand. This is one reason. Then the other thing is reporting systems as well. So, I mean, the Ethiopian Ministry of Health and the EPHI did a great job in setting up this DHIS2 database system, and which worked really nice. But also it needs some time to set up a database system and to report data on a large scale. But still, I mean, if we all didn't have these things, why didn't we have seen those scenes like in China, where people were coming, crowded, clusters of pneumonia? We didn't see it in such a way in Africa. At least I didn't see it in Asala. Yeah. And some colleagues from me in Nairobi said also, they didn't know it like that. Or in Jimma, we have some friends, they said, no, we haven't seen it. So why is it like this? So some factors may contribute to this. One is, which mobility does population have, and especially also to the rural areas? So how much does transportation costs, and how mobile are people?
Right, in order to spread the illness.
So this is one thing. So we had the first case in Asela in June, and we were screening like crazy, like hell. I mean, we were like running up with 300 PCRs a day, and the Ministry of Health had a big screening campaign, so it took some time to detect those cases. So, but another reason, let's come back to the reasons. In Ethiopia, how much, maybe you know better than I do, but I guess like 90 or 95% of the population is younger than 60.
Yes, I mean not 95, but from the latest demographic estimation, it's about 80 to 85% of the population is under 60,
and round about 50% under the age of 50.
Exactly. Yeah. Roundabout.
Yeah. So if we see take a look on COVID, it's one of those things that children were less affected. So or younger people were less affected. So this may be an impact that it's just a not noticed infection. Also, you have to take into account, when do you search healthcare? When do you go to a healthcare facility? You have a small sneezing, and then you take a long way to a university hospital to get tested.
Yeah.
I don't think so. And in Western countries, maybe you searched this a little bit earlier, because we also did crazy, and every sneezing, every coughing, every fever was assumed to be COVID at that time. So
whereas here we're so used to so many other illnesses that would be another reason to be like. I mean, I got colds while COVID was happening. Sure. I was like, probably not. You know what I mean? Like, and I wouldn't even necessarily get tested because, if anything, one of the ironies of COVID was that I noticed it myself in my own health that because of the wearing masks, because of the staying at home, because of the precautions, the vitamin C, the washing,
countries did a strategy. They did this hard and early in the beginning, which was very,
all
very
of a sudden, people weren't getting as sick as as they normally did
Yeah.
before COVID. You know, from the random viruses.
I remember
that come and go.
personally, like the first year after COVID had started as a pandemic, I had absolutely no cold, and I always like at least 3 to 4 times. It is inevitable when the spring to summer change, the winter season, the start of the winter season, or like the rainy season for us. Anytime the temperature got really cold, which is like at the start of our year, which is like around the end of December to January, which is getting really cold, I would definitely get that. And that never happened because it was mostly because we were, living in a very highly social world, and that kind of went away. But I didn't
on the other hand, you are referring to the weather. When COVID hit Ethiopia, it was not rainy season, so the people were not that crowded maybe in the houses. But when the first cases were, it was maybe a lot of people did not spend too crowded together, and also like how to say, religious meetings like churches and mosques were also a little bit told to pay attention. I don't know. People, of course, don't stick to all these rules, but maybe the weather also had some impact. We've seen the seasonality of coronaviruses in Europe, so it's basically when it's cold, the incidence is rising. When it's warm, the incidence is declining.
Yeah, I mean, we can think about so many different cases why the COVID pandemic in Africa, and especially in Ethiopia, has not been so so dangerous, or the numbers or the severity has not been that much. But I don't think we should forget about the genetic materials as well, because in many, many ways I've seen people who are above 60, 70 years old who have been intubated, who have even needed a lot more oxygen, get off the intubation and get off oxygen so much faster than people who are the same demographic as them, the same kind of chronic diseases as them, but just tend to be other races. So I don't. That's what I've been trying to say even earlier when we are having a conversation. So even with the production of the vaccinations, I don't think East African communities have been studied as much as the rest of the races to know how further to resist ourselves from the disease, even in the further run. Because people, you would see these people who are really, really chronically with chronic diseases and with age limits about the same as what you see in Italy or any parts of the country, the other countries where the older ages were dying off within weeks of each other, within days of each other, and I don't think it's been studied that well.
Well, some ideas on that are that studies have been done in the US, and they have been investigating why some black communities are more severely affected than others. I mean, this was in the US maybe more to socioeconomic reasons, but
I was going to get to one. I'll give you one real quick, because this is what I was thinking since you guys went into this. One factor in the U.S. in particular that is a key factor when it comes to so many different health crises, even the crisis of what they call attention, all the attention deficit crisis, mental health crisis, different kinds of social, that is always under discussed as a factor is obesity. And diet in particular, especially black and brown communities, or the predisposition to poverty. Usually poor rural and urban communities in America, the kind of food that they're fed, the kind of lack of opportunities for proper kind of dieting, it is contributing. I mean, the numbers that I see, the majority, like literally over 50% of those who have died of COVID, and obviously the United States has very high numbers of COVID deaths, have been overweight or obese people, and that seems to be happening in much of the world too.
Definitely, this may be one of those big reasons, but the other one. What people, even if you calculate these effects, is that there was no protecting factor in being black, and in originating, or being an African American or whatever.
Right. There's no a black gene that
Not this, but what may play a major role is how you grew up. And America, you can think of those parents being overprotective to their babies and protecting them from every mud and dirt and this hygiene hypothesis, which makes link to allergies later.
Right.
And in Africa, you may be exposed just more to infections as you can avoid it. The children
develop
are
more
playing on the
immunity.
street, yes, they have definitely a differently primed immune system. And we always also tried to investigate this. We didn't get the funds for that, but it would have been a very nice study to investigate. So this priming of the immune system and the age may play the most dominant roles. And another thing may be that the density of people may not be as high as in European cities. I mean, take New York, which is how many, 17 million? I don't know how many.
Well, New York, I mean, the greater it depends what you define as New York, right? 10 to 20.
But the surface area in comparison to the people that live in it, definitely in most parts of Africa, people are so sparsely living that even
New York
if
is
it's
a vertical city, right? It's almost all
even if they
people
live
living
in a
on top
small
of each other.
community in parts of Africa, they still have green areas and pastures that they could live off. So there's still this wide space of living space that is so
this
much
may also
easier.
have inhibited the spread. The question is the secondary attack rate. So what happens in the households? Then this may be different in Africa. It may be much more easier if you have a bigger house or a bigger flat in Europe to hide from each other and to stick to hygiene rules and stay away and those things. So this may be a protective factor then for the Europeans. But one thing not to underestimate, there's been a survey study conducted by the University of Jimma together with some colleagues from Munich, and they were assessing the seroprevalence of COVID in Ethiopia. It's also published. And they were seeing like that in August 2020, there have been like 10% of the population being infected. Already in August 2020. So this means this strategy of stay home and somehow like that, it worked out on a certain level. But when they took the second measurement later in, I think it was February 2021, 53% of the people have been infected or have a proof of infection by serology. So this means also in Ethiopia there was a huge spread of COVID. So
there was. It got to a point where people accepted like everyone's gonna get this now. Like, there's no point in resisting now.
It was just like a cold at some point where we're like, okay, now
I've COVID. Yes.
It's a little bit like what happened now with all these variants, which is the spread increases and the because apparently, and I didn't know this, I would have breathed a sigh of relief. But people told me eventually that actually the way infectious diseases generally work is the more they spread, the less deadly they are, right? Yeah. So like you had this spread of the disease to the point that that it became like any other. But one thing I was thinking about when you mentioned the racial aspect, right? Like the fact that Black Americans tend to get it kind of disproves that there's at least a genetic aspect to the prevalence or non-prevalence. It's a reversal of the sort of the theories that went into HIV. Remember, HIV people would say, and again, who knows if this is even provable, that Europeans had been exposed to, and it wasn't a virus, right? But it's the deadliest infectious illness ever, which over hundreds of years was the Black Plague, and that the Black, because of that, Europeans were a little more tolerant of HIV, or wasn't going to spread as much as.
It's a little. Well, I wouldn't say it's true. That's wrong. But there's in like 10% of the European population, there's some receptor mutation which is protecting them a little more than, and this mutation is not prevalent in Africa. So to be seen. But anyway. Regarding to HIV, this is something almost everyone is going to be affected by.
Yeah.
So you think that one was a myth?
More or less.
Or both
of them.
More for myth.
More.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
it's fascinating when you start getting into all the different factors that go into the spread of illness and how significant it is. I mean, this is the kind of thing that determines. There's that famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. You know that book? It's like a famous sort of one of those meta history narratives. Diamond is the guy's name. I think Jared Diamond is the guy's name. But he sort of posits that the reason Europe emerged as the why Europe. He looks at guns, the development of weapons, obviously the movement to the Steel Age, but also illnesses, right? And the way that determines the flows of
being in the
population.
nicely protected northern temperate zone.
Yeah.
Most of the germs are dead by then, like because of the weather already. So you can never, get it, or the person will die before they can spread it so much.
But did you know that like until like let's say 70 years ago there was also malaria endemic in Germany?
That was one of the first things
Malaria.
Malaria, yeah, really. You wouldn't guess it, right? But especially in the northern Germany parts, they had like tertiary malaria, so which was hiding in, with the cows and in this rural environment, and we still had a lot of like seas, ponds, lakes, moist places. And in this climate, it was possible that people get malaria infections. It's someone from Germany now would malaria in Germany, no, never.
I mean, but
there's a pride associated with illnesses now, because I noticed this with some older.
I mean, like
Ethiopian
when you think
men.
about TB and malaria and all the other like tropical old age diseases,
Right.
People
It's
don't want to
associated
get it in Europe.
Sure.
They don't want that association.
No, of course,
to
people
them.
don't want to get ill, but
No,
what I
like
thought was
that particular one, though.
right,
like
but
HIV, and
right,
malaria,
the stigma,
TB,
right?
Yeah.
It's
So
like
that's a poor people
those right.
disease,
That's
right?
an illness for. It's so interesting because that's one thing, and I thought of this as a coping mechanism for some older Ethiopians that I know, who are scared. Right, a lot of old people, especially, are like they're seeing their friends die around them. This could be it, right? For them, one of the things that they were able to do, I think, to cope with it, people I spoke to, was to think of it along those pride terms. You mentioned self-confidence earlier.
Yeah.
Right? Like those terms of national pride, like,
And that
aha,
really works, by the way.
we're-
It's like
we have
it's a
such low
medically
numbers.
proven. It's a medically proven way of getting better.
Well, is it like a placebo thing?
Not just that, but your body normally produces hormones based on your emotions, right? So whenever you're sick and you tell yourself continuously, I'm gonna get better. I'm fine. I'm gonna get
nationality.
Yeah, but because of that, like,
Because your pride,
you know that, like,
historically.
the manly pride there in a
Right.
lot of Ethiopians, the patriotic pride, where especially mostly the men are like, we're complete. This disease of like minor cold, it would never kill us, and that thought process in many ways have helped a lot of people who are like, especially in the older age group, to actually be better.
See, that's interesting to me because that might help to explain. You guys are doctors, so maybe you can explain this to me. I thought about this in the context of comedy. One of my favorite comedians, one of your favorite comedians, Norm Macdonald, died of cancer. Right? And he was making this joke about he made a bunch of cancer jokes, and then people found out why he was making cancer jokes. He was like, people talk about fighting cancer like you're in battle. Really, like you're just sitting there, a cancer patient, as an old man singing. He said, watching Matlock on TV, and that's his version of fighting a battle. But like, I always found that interesting that people would be like, "Hey, you got to fight it," or like, and I'm like, "What is this?" They have no real effect on, but people would be like, "Oh, this person just kind of gave up and died," and so I'm wrong about this. People are actually fighting.
I can tell you numbers, but the idea is I think there have been studies investigating these effects, and as far as I know, they also showed that people with certain cancers who had a more positive attitude measured on some scale were performing better than others. So
people who pray, or that kind of
yes, on the one hand, these attitudes, religion can also be a protective factor, and
even before it starts, because a lot of the stress hormones that we produce, they have effects of closing cancer.
It's also another concept. I mean, religion makes it more like something you cannot avoid this disease, and if you're not religious, you may say, okay, well, it's my personal fault to get sick or something.
Yes, you get more stress.
Why me?
It's a different concept,
right.
which makes.
But that's especially for palliative care, right? When a person when they're confronted with the 5 stages of death and dying.
Not just that, but I've seen people who have said, okay, this is a God's will, whatever kind of will, and I'm perfectly fine dying at some point, and they've lived for years, and even they have remissions from their cancer, because they're like, they're just saying, okay, this is my time, I'm gonna die, but I'm gonna be okay with it.
It's the one side of the medal, and the other side of the medal is there's a patient. Let's say he has an acute kidney failure or something like that, and they say, okay, well, good, let's pray and do something, and use some holy water or prayers, bring him to a special priest or whatever. And then they don't think of specific treatment. They overrate also those religious aspects. This is as far as what I've seen here from some young patients dying, and I was kind of shocked because I would never have expected that approach in Germany, right?
Of
This
course,
was
of
completely
course.
new to me.
Of course,
Then they're saying like, okay, he goes home.
Yes,
we do it with the traditional way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that like completely taking away the medical perspective or medical treatment is like the best way to go when it comes to palliative care or, end stage cancer. But what I'm trying to like portray in many ways that I've seen, and especially in Ethiopian patients, is the idea of stress hormones or hormones that are produced whenever a person has continuous stress or even after finding out they have cancer, is the way they ideologize what it means to be sick, what it means to be dying. It really helps in many ways to see how their treatments is working, to know whether they're like, especially with diseases like COVID, where where the amount of treatment you get is quite common. It's the same for everyone, but people tend to get better when they are mentally and psychologically stronger, and they know they're like they have that energy to live for longer, and they would beat this. Yeah. Those factors do affect in a lot of ways, and that I've seen in patients practically.
It doesn't even necessarily always have to be a psychosomatic or what people call placebo or anything like that. It could also be, like just basically like if you're depressed, you tend to sleep a certain way, you tend to possibly not eat the way you should, and then of course those things are going to affect your physiological right.
People tend to be active and more. For example, when it comes to COVID, and you have that active infection and your oxygen levels are going down, and your chest is trying its very best to rid of those viruses and those, it's starting to fight itself. People being active and energetic and actively trying to take out all of those irritative foreign sputums or whatsoever out are much more likely to wean off oxygen or to get off any kind of restraint from their chest. And that kind of affects, in a way, hormonally and, based on their hormones, based on their stress hormones that they produce as well. Because, for example, when we talk about asthma, it has a lot to do with not just having a chest, vasoconstriction and your chest trying to take out all the air away from you, and you can't breathe in because it's so difficult. It actually means that if you relax and all of your stress hormones are on that relaxed level, you are most likely to open up your lungs as well. Right. Of course, the pathology works as well.
The top-down approach we're caring for those patients, right?
Yes, of course.
Trying to call them,
Yeah.
That's why people care about the doctor having a good bedside manner, right? Like, that's the expression. I don't know if you guys know that expression. It's an American expression. The bedside manner, right? Like the doctor has to kind of be like a good person too. So,
they have to be patient and calming and all that.
Especially in patients with respiratory failure, it's important to calm them down.
Yeah.
And
people think heart attacks and anxiety attacks are exactly the same, and they've done the studies, and the pain level is exactly the same.
It is, I can say. I've been working in emergency services now for the last half a year in Germany.
And one is pathologic and one is psychosomatic. Yeah. But they still both feel the same thing. That says something, right?
Yeah.
But I mean...
And even the professionals getting the calls on the phone, they could not distinguish whether this patient truly has some myocardial infarction or just a panic attack. It's challenging.
Yeah, but I mean, it does affect quite a lot. So I think one of the reasons, getting back to the whole COVID thing, is definitely the people's mentality and perspective as well. But I think to finish up our conversation, I really think we should do more studies about the genetic susceptibility. Especially, I want to point out that Black women should be studied more, because even with the pandemic, you've seen most of the women, even if they're older, they're taking care of their daughters, their sons, their husbands, and they basically don't have any symptoms at all.
But you've seen it also in Europe, that women are more protected.
Yes, of course.
Die more. I mean, this is some basic immunology And
But
I
that
mean,
can be genetic as well, because
Yeah, of
as you
course,
know,
of course.
XX chromosome,
Sure.
it's like
Definitely.
when you have two different, if you don't know this, if when you have two XX chromosomes, we have more genetic material than men, because XY, the Y one has only 70 genes in it, while women have 1,000. Two X's means 2,000 genes, while XY means 1,070, 1,070. So there are so many mutations and genetic susceptibilities of finding out whether we if we studied black women, we'd have the most likelihood of knowing what genetically is wrong with us. That's all I can say.
That's a great place, I think, to end. We managed, I think, to discuss in
So
quite some
many things,
details,
I guess,
not just two things, but when I think about it, the two major crises that have really taken
Yes,
over the
the
media
war
and
and
defined, one after the other, right?
medical
And,
and
retroactively
the
we started with
ammunition wars.
right with Ukraine, and then going back to the pandemic. It is so interesting though, because the last conversation we had on here was about media with Izana, and talking about like the waves, the trends that take over the media. I very rarely, I think other than 9/11, when America went into this spiral for like a month and everybody was just in a trance in front of their television, I've very rarely seen two events sort of just kind of take over the public discourse in the media, one after the other, right? Completely different, but Ukraine and
feels
COVID.
very hopeless. The last 10 years have been very hopeless.
I suppose, but it also gives the media and the viewer something to kind of channel. No, really, like, because I don't have a television. I don't spend too much time on social. I don't spend so much on social. But I see the comfort that people have in not having to, their minds, their mental health.
To be
They could,
distracted.
they could have one thing to kind of pour their minds into
Yeah.
that keeps them out off their own kind of problems.
Yeah.
And their own kind of,
but it's not the end of history.
it is not the end of history.
We'll
I actually
still make history.
it's so
I'm
funny
pretty
you
sure.
say that, because I literally used to say that to people all the time when people would get really prisoner of the moment about stuff. It's like we've been through this in our lifetimes. Fukuyama told us in 1990, because the Berlin Wall fell, that nothing ever was going to happen again, right? And then 5 years later, you had the Rwandan genocide and the assassination of Rabin, and then 10 years later, you had 9/11. So enough of that theory.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you both so much for coming on.
You were very welcome.
It's been nice. It's nice to have you back, Mahi.
I will definitely be here more.
Please come by anytime. And then, Yani, I know you have to go back, but you'll be back again. Right?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
And you're both always welcome. You're both always encouraged to come on anytime. So thanks to the both of you. You've been listening to Ras Temari Radio. Offense necessary.
This generation rules the nation.
Yo, sama waji